Welcome back. And yesterday I introduced the very first speaker from outside the community up on the studio stage. And today I can also present the last external speaker from outside our community down here. And with big pleasure, I announce
Ondřej.
Thank you, thank you. Much better than I can. Who likes to criticize code from others so much that he built a tool to do it for him. And it is an amazing tool. It is PHPStan.
Thank you very much for having me here. I never had a live band introducing me on stage, so that was really nice. And I'm going to be talking about how you should test your applications in a way that saves time and effort from my experience. But first, I would like to ask who already uses PHPStan? Yeah, almost everyone. That's great. So I don't have to spend a lot of time introducing it. It's a tool that analyzes your whole code base at once. It looks for bugs that are easy to detect just by looking at the code from types point of view. So the output looks like this, and it will tell you errors like when you are returning a string from a function that is supposed to return an integer, or if you are calling a method that does not exist, for example. So these are bugs that will crash your PHP application, but some bugs are much trickier to find when running your code because they are bugs in your code, but they stay silent when you execute them. So for example, if you ask about something that does not exist, for example, if foo instance of foo, where the foo class does not exist at all, PHP will just silently skip this condition. Or if you are trying to catch an exception that does not exist at all, it will also skip the catch block. And even if you are trying to get a class name as a string out of a class that does not exist at all, PHP will happily create this string for you without emitting any kind of error. But of course, PHPStan will point out all of these errors for you, so it's really useful to run it. But today's talk is going to be mostly about types, so we kind of have to define what a type system is. And type system answers this question: are parts of a program connected in a consistent way for you? So to rephrase this, we can also ask, does an application work from the types point of view? So for example, if you are returning a null from a function that is supposed to return a string, or if you are returning an integer from a function that is supposed to return a string, or if you are trying to pass an integer to a function that only accepts strings, all of these problems mean that you have a bug that is possible to detect with the type system. Here we are calling an unknown method, and here we are trying to pass a string to a property that only accepts integers. This one is actually a little bit trickier, right? Because this method does not need to exist on the class, because it might be a magic method that if a method is not declared as a native method on the class, the magic method underscore call is called, and it might actually do something useful. And with PHPStan, there are ways how to describe even your magic methods. So even if your code is using them, you can still have a green build for when static analysis is running. And yeah, this is also a problem. So if we are creating new foo and bar is a class, PHPStan can point out that this condition is never going to be true, because if foo does not extend bar, it means that this if condition, this if branch is never going to be executed. So I have a confession to make. I don't write tests for everything. I write tests for some code, but I don't write tests for everything. because some bugs can be found by static analysis, so why would I write tests for them, right? So at the beginning, the situation in your code probably looks like this. You have some bugs found by your tests, and also some bugs and some same kind of bugs are going to be found by PHPStan. So the intersection of these two circles is probably a wasted effort, right? Why would we write tests for something that can be found by PHPStan? So our goal is to make these circles not overlap, to only focus on efforts on bugs that can only be found by tests. And in the end, we can also make the orange circle smaller, because we can write our application in a way that more and more bugs will be found by PHPStan by static analysis. So it might be a little bit controversial, but I think that 100% code coverage is not realistic to be able to achieve it, and it might be expensive and wasteful. So my opinion is that you should focus your tests writing efforts in places where it's not possible to be detected by types only. All right, who is logging notices in production? No one? So the problem in PHP is that the most severe errors are usually notices. So you should really be logging them and solving these errors, because accessing undefined variables, missing keys in an array, accessing unknown constants, these are all notices. So the first step to have a functioning, working application is to be logging everything and seeing what kind of errors are flowing through your code. Who is familiar with the term stringly typed code? Yeah, so stringly, not strongly. So when everything is a string, you don't really know if you are passing the correct value or the wrong value in your code, because everything is a string. So it's really easy to, for example, pass a zip code into an email, even if they are incompatible values, right? So this is not the correct approach to save effort on testing. Because by using primitive types like integers or strings, you are not communicating much information how your code can be used. So you should always think about what possible values are correct and not. Because if you are accepting a string, does it mean that you are accepting an empty string as well? Are you accepting non-ASCII values? Are you accepting emojis? And it's not really possible to do this with stringly typed code. But if you introduce data transfer objects, if you introduce objects, you can validate the correct values in the constructor, and the rest of the application is going to work properly and only with valid values, which is really nice. So yeah, my first tip is using objects for everything, because then it's not possible to pass an incompatible or completely wrong value into a parameter. And it also applies to return types as well. My next tip is to avoid union parameters. So it might be really tempting to implement a function or a method that can accept all kinds of inputs and then differentiate inside what should happen to those inputs. But jack of all trades is usually jack of none. So I would like you to avoid this kind of code, and it's much better to have multiple different functions that each accept only a single kind of type. And then based on what kind of type we are currently holding in a variable, we can decide by ourselves what method we need to call. Our goal is to get rid of these conditions, because you might have a bug in them. So it's better to completely avoid all of this and decide by yourself as a developer how to call this properly how to call a specific proper method when we have a specific kind of value in our variables. My next tip is to avoid Boolean parameters. So this function can either be called with true or false as the second parameter, and it's going to do something different. So why is it a single function? And the calls look like this. They are a little bit cryptic because we don't know what the false or what true means. So instead of the Boolean parameter, it's better to get rid of it and to have, again, two different methods to kind of differentiate between the use cases and decide what method, what function we need to call when we want to do something specific. So this is really obvious what it's doing, but this is not obvious at all. All right. Next, I'm just telling you what kind of things I want you to avoid in your code. I realize that. So next, I want you to avoid nullable and optional parameters. So let's say that we have a method on our entity that is setting validity. So we are setting a from date and a to date. And let's say the customer comes and he wants to remove these dates from the entity. He wants to reset the entity so that it doesn't have any validity. So the first instinct that we usually follow is to make these things nullable. So this will allow the user, the customer, to pass null values in there, which will, of course, erase the fields, and we will have nulls in our entity. But the problem with this API is that it can be called in a wrong way. So this is an intended usage. This is also an intended usage. But this combination of multiple nullable parameters also allows us to call this in an unintended way, which means that we are passing one date and a null, or we are passing null and a date. And this is not what we intended when we wanted to allow the user to remove the validity from our entity. So you can avoid this by, for example, checking if the user passed both values or if they have passed only null values with some kind of complicated if conditions in your code that you need to test later with unit tests. Or you can completely avoid this problem just with types, which means that instead of a single method that accepts nullable parameters, you need to introduce two different methods. So the first method allows us to set the values, and the second method allows us to remove the values. So there isn't a wrong way how we can call this. And if someone calls this a wrong way, PHPStan itself is going to point it out. If we pass nulls only here, it's going to tell us that we cannot pass nulls into this method because it requires datetime immutables. All right. Did anyone write a code like this in the past year? OK, someone did. So dynamic code like this is also basically invisible to static analysis because we don't know what's in the dollar variable, so we don't know what actual variable are we accessing here. We don't know if it exists. We don't know the type. So PHPStan is basically flying blind and doesn't know how to analyze this code and how to point out mistakes here because anything can happen here. So it's too dynamic. So we are accessing a variable or a property, or we are calling a method with a dynamic name that can be anything. And we really don't know if this is, for example, a valid method call, because the method can be private, it might have required arguments, and we really don't know what method are you calling, so this is impossible to detect by PHPStan. So instead of code like this, I would recommend you to always call a specific method and maybe dispatch it in a switch statement or a match expression or some kind of conditions like that, because then PHPStan will know that whether you can call the method or not. So yeah, also discouraged. Who likes to use two equal signs for comparing values? No, two people, OK. So this is really tricky, and it doesn't apply only to PHP. It also applies to JavaScript, for example. You really don't know what the language is going to return from the top of your head, because it's really unpredictable. So some of the weirdest ones are, for example, that an empty array equals to null. Why? Like, it doesn't make any sense. Empty string equals 0. String with 0 equals false. So it really doesn't make any sense. And if you use two equal signs or exclamation mark and single equal sign, it means that you probably have some unexpected behavior in your code. So it's much better to use three equal signs, because that is completely predictable, and only the same types with the same values are going to return true for these comparisons. Next, I would also like you to avoid empty, because it has the same problems. Empty is just two equal signs in a different clothing. So empty returns true for, of course, empty string, but also 0, 0 as a float, a string with a 0, and null, false, and an empty array. So it's much better to write a more precise condition instead of an empty, because empty can also hide bugs, because empty also does not error on undefined variables. It just returns true. So I would really like to discourage that. And who is using PHPStan strict rules? Right, a few people. Probably not the same ones that like to use two equal signs for comparing. So PHPStan strict rules, this is an opinionated package. So out of the box, PHPStan does not discourage you from using these patterns, because PHPStan itself tries to be objective, not subjective. So it's possible that your code might be correct even if you are using two equal signs, but it's very unlikely. But PHPStan itself does not report errors for this. But because I have opinions and I want to give people access to these opinions, I created PHPStan strict rules, and it will report some behavior in your code as wrong. So if you install this package, it will follow a lot of advices from this talk. So it will tell you that you should not use empty, you should not use two equal signs. It will require only booleans in conditions. So it's not going to be OK to, for example, write if count something, because you don't have a boolean in that condition. You have an integer, right? If you are only asking if count, you are not comparing a boolean but an integer. It wants you to write if count greater than 0, for example, which makes the code much more obvious. It's very useful, for example, if you have a string and you ask if string something, it means that you are eliminating multiple values at once. You are eliminating nullable values, and you are also eliminating empty strings, and you are also eliminating strings with 0. So it's much better to write an explicit condition that results in a boolean, for example, like if string is not equal to an empty string. That's code that PHPStan strict rules will be satisfied with. Also, some function calls are use loose comparison by default. So in array or array search need third parameter set to true in order to behave more strictly. All right, PHPStan rule levels. So most of you raised your hand when I asked if you are using PHPStan. Are you at least on PHPStan level 5? PHPStan level 6? OK, nice. 7, 8, 9, 10. OK, nice. OK, cool. So today, I don't want you to pass level 9 or 10. And not even PHPStan itself is analyzed on level 9. It uses level 8. So But what's relevant for this talk is level 6, because it forces you to fill in missing type hints. So if your code wouldn't have any types, PHPStan would just say that everything is OK, everything is green, because it cannot check anything. But if you introduce types, suddenly PHPStan has some information to work with. So that's why there is this level in the middle, level 6, that forces you to add all missing types. And it also forces you to say what's in your array. So here we can say that we have an array of users, and there is a lot more advanced types, not just related to arrays, but also to other types. So you can say what's in the array. You can also say that we have a list, not just an array, but a list, which means that the indexes are consecutive and start at 0. And you can also say that you have a non-empty arrays or lists, which means that there's at least one item inside. And did anyone use array shapes before? Yeah, a lot of people. These are great if you don't want to refactor your application into data transfer objects. You can just describe what's in your arrays, and PHPStan will successfully analyze even your legacy application that you don't need to refactor. You can look into more supported types in PHP docs. So for example, we have integer ranges. You can also reference to class constants and global constants in your PHP docs. We have type aliases. If you don't want to repeat the same complicated type over and over, you can just alias it. There's much more to it, and you can check out the documentation about it. All right, generics. Who has ever used generics in PHP docs, in PHP? All right, some people, not everyone. The benefit of generics is that without them, PHPStan doesn't see what value the customer can be, because this is a query bus pattern. Anyone used it before? Okay, a few people, but it doesn't matter. This is applicable throughout a lot of different everyday situations that you have. For example, you can say what's in a collection, and so on. But I wanted to demonstrate generics on this example. So this method, out of the box, can only ship with a mixed type, right? Because it will be used for dispatching a lot of different queries. So this can just have a mixed type, which means that if we look at this code, we are asking about the result of a find customer by ID query. So kind of intuitively, we developers know what's going to be in this variable, right? It's going to be a customer. But the static analyzer does not know it. Cannot know it if we don't include generics in the mix. And without generics, it's not possible to infer the correct return type for this method, because it depends what we pass as a parameter to the method call. So in order to inform PHPStan what's going to happen inside, we have to introduce some extra annotations, some extra PHP docs. So first, we are going to make our query generic, which means that we are going to introduce something called a template type or a type variable. And then we are going to say that the class find customer by ID is a query about customers. And then we can type hint our query bus dispatch method with another template. We are going to say that it's a generic over this parameter. And during a method call, PHPStan is going to figure out that it's going to look at the past parameter, at the find customer by ID query. It's going to look what its type variable is. It's going to extract it, and it's going to return it. So in the end, PHPStan is going to know that if we call dispatch with find customer by ID, the result is object of class customer. I know it's a lot to take in. This talk is not supposed to be about generics. I just wanted to give you a little taste about what's possible and how to make PHPStan more aware about types, even in these tricky situations that are not yet possible to describe with the native type system in PHP. And if you want, you can learn more about generics from different articles on PHPStan's website and PHPStan's blog. All right, next I have a refactoring tip for you. So if we have a fully strongly typed application, we can use the types to our advantage. So when the requirements about your application change, if something before used to be just a single value and now it has to be multiple values. For example, if I'm used to the e-commerce world. So for example, before user could have a single delivery address, and now the new requirement is that a user can have multiple delivery addresses to choose from when they are checking out a product in the cart. It means that suddenly we have to change some assumptions that we made in our code, right? So my process, how to start working on this feature request, on this change request, would be to break the types first. So suddenly, user get delivery address does not make sense to me. So I just delete the method or I rename it. So suddenly, user get delivery address becomes user get delivery addresses. And when I rename this method on the user class and I run PHPStan, it's going to point out basically everything that I need to do throughout the code to fix this sudden change of requirements. So this is really efficient way how to get the idea how much work is ahead of us, like this. And you can rename methods, you can remove methods, you can, for example, change the return type. So PHPStan is going to tell you when your code suddenly needs fixing, and I think it's very useful. You can also add a required parameter because, as I said before, optional parameters, I'm not really a fan of them. I would say that they are evil because they hide bugs really easily. Because by introducing a required parameter, you are forcing the user to decide what kind of value needs to be passed there. If you introduce an optional parameter, you decide for them, and the decision might be wrong in some percentage of uses of that method, right? So if you are not concerned, if you are not supporting developers in an open source library, if you are only writing code for yourself and your company, I very much like adding required parameters. And I think that a similar approach would also work for open source, because instead of silently adding an optional parameter somewhere, if you really want people to decide, if you really want to force people what they should pass somewhere, you could deprecate a default method with one single required parameter, and you could add another method with two required parameters. So everyone who runs PHPStan, they will suddenly know that they are using a deprecated version of some method, and they should switch to the new method, and they should start passing two parameters instead of one, which really forces people to start using the new code and have a more modern application instead of piling on legacy debt. All right, so this is how usually types should flow throughout your application. So at the beginning, we have an HTTP request. And of course, everything in an HTTP request, in a GET request or a POST request, is going to be weakly typed, right? Because we are going over the wire, and everything is just a string. And in my opinion, the goal of the controller before calling the rest of the application in an MVC application should be to validate these values and make them strongly typed. So make typed objects, make data transfer objects out of the weakly typed values coming over HTTP. And the rest of the application is already strongly typed, so it's much easier for static analysis to spot bugs. And to understand where you can save effort on writing tests and where you should focus, I usually differentiate all code in an application into two big categories. So the first category is wiring, is all the boring code that you need to write to actually get down to the business logic, which is the second and more important category. And wiring is like all the controllers, all the facades, passing values, getters, setters. It's all the boilerplate. But usually in modern applications, more than or maybe around 50% of the code is just wiring. It's just passing values somewhere, and the rest is business logic that we are actually paid to do. But wiring is not completely useless, right? Like it enables us to reuse our code. It enables us to test our code, to maintain our code. So we really need wiring, but it's not all there is to a working application. So we have wiring, and then we have business logic, and that's the actual interesting stuff. So that's what we are paid to do. So it's value validation, arithmetic operations, routing, filtering, parsing, state machines. It's basically where we have our if conditions and loops. It's the interesting business logic that we should actually be testing. So wiring, that's not interesting in my opinion. That's sufficient to cover by static analysis by having strong types. And business logic is where you should focus your unit tests on. But first, we actually need to define what's a unit test. So there are all kinds of tests in our application, right? We have integration tests that are touching all kinds of things and maybe a little bit slow, a little bit flaky, because they are testing our application end to end. But when an integration test fails, it's really hard to locate where the bug is, because our whole application was executed, so the bug can be anywhere, or it can be in a flaky network connection or something. But unit test is only executed PHP code and only in memory, and does not connect to the database, does not access the file system, does not make network calls, and shouldn't even need some assembling, shouldn't even need a DI container. And if you actually follow this and you write unit tests, they are going to be very fast. And if you break a unit test, it's going to tell you everything it's going to tell you exactly where your bug is. And also, who likes to mock objects? Who likes to mock classes? Yeah. So. Yeah, me neither, because mocking is basically lying, but with the approach that I'm just about to show you, you actually shouldn't need mocks, because you will only have value objects flowing through your code, and value objects should be easy to construct. So with proper unit tests, you shouldn't need mock objects, which means that they are going to be much less brittle, much more solid, and that's a good thing, in my opinion. So this is typically how a code looks like. So we are fetching some data, we do some business logic with them, then we fetch another data, and we do business logic with both results, most likely, most usually. And the problem with this is that if you want to unit test this function, you would have to mock these repository calls, which we don't like to do. So this code is basically impossible to unit test, or if you manage to unit test it, it's going to be very brittle. And the problem is that we are having both data fetching and both business logic, and also the business logic in a single class, in a single unit, which makes nice unit testing impossible. So instead, what I recommend is to extract the business logic so that it has just clean parameters, clean inputs, and clean outputs, everything wrapped in value objects. So in practice, you will have business logic living here, and it's going to be executed from your usual application, from your controller, or from something called facade. And it's going to be the goal of the facade to fetch the data from the repository in production and feed them to the business logic. But on the other hand, in your tests, in your unit tests, you will only call the business logic with manually constructed data, and you will be able to stress the business logic with lots of different combinations, with lots of different values, and really make sure that it's correct. Everybody with me? So this is how the business logic usually looks like. So we have inputs and we have an output, and the business logic is not allowed to fetch something besides what we passed inside, because that means that we would have to suddenly mock the business logic, which we don't want to do. So everything the business logic needs, it needs to accept it from the outside and return a result. Basically, the result is instructions for the caller, what it needs to do with the result. Yeah. And this is how we are going to call it from production code. We are going to fetch the data and pass it to the business logic, for example, some kind of calculator. And on the test side, we are going to usually I test with data providers because it's very easy to test multiple different scenarios, and my data providers are usually very, very huge. And data provider actually lets me call this test multiple times with different inputs. So I usually pass the parameters needed for the business logic and expected results that I assert after I call the business logic. So we are nearing near the end of my talk. So my approach to testing is to differentiate between wiring and business logic. And some parts of my code are boring. They are just wiring. So these are statically verified by PHPStan. And if I have something interesting in the middle of other code, I extract it to a separate unit testable class with clean inputs and clean outputs. And I inject it into the original class where I call the wiring, then I call my business logic, and then I call wiring again. And yeah, that's my approach. Okay, that's all from me today. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Ondřej, for this wonderful talk. This is for you.
Thank you very much.
I have a couple of questions, if you don't mind.
Okay.
We have the time. So, what do you think of the latest RFC to add generics to PHP? How would this affect?
I already commented on it
Okay.
in the mailing list.
All right.
So yeah, of course I'm in favor of this RFC because yeah, that could be another 1 hour talk, right?
Of course.
I don't know who is familiar with the generics RFC that's been lately published. A few people. Well, it's about. I showed you generics in PHP docs, right? There are people that want native syntax for these generics, but the problem is performance impact, because if the PHP engine would check everything on runtime, it would take a long time. So the idea is that these types would be erased. They would live in the source code, but they actually wouldn't mean anything for the engine, which is unprecedented. It's unprecedented for PHP developers, but on the other hand, us, who already write these generics in PHP docs, these are also not runtime checked, right? So it's kind of precedented for us static analysis users. And I think that this RFC is our only shot it's our only shot for the next 10 years how to get generics into PHP. So that's why I'm in favor. But I understand that for some PHP users, it's unprecedented that you would have types in code and they would not be checked. Yeah.
For PHPStan, do you think it's perfect? Is the phrasing, I would say, finished? And if no, what do you think is needed, or how long does it take?
You should see my to-do list. it's still write only.
Okay.
But it's getting better thanks to AI, because AI can help me with some stuff. So now I'm able to, for the to-do list to not grow as much. I'm able to finish more stuff, but still I have a lot of ideas. And me and my contributors, like Marcus here in the front row, we are working on GitHub every day, improving it. So like, there's no end in sight. Like, I don't ever see like working on something else. Hopefully,
Calling it finished, done.
Yeah.
Right. Very
Unless people stop using PHP or yeah. But even the agents can use PHPStan, and it's very encouraged. So even if we don't write code by hand, even if it's written by agents, it's very encouraged to be checked by PHPStan, because it will point out mistakes that the agents do. Yeah.
Right. If you as a coder follow the best practices you laid out for us here, do you see any need for using PHPStan ignore next line or similar stuff? Is there anything you would have in mind where there's just no way to express that nicely even while following best practices?
Of course, I also myself ignore some things, but I treat it as technical debt, and I try to get the list of ignored things to be small and small over time. So I treat it as technical debt, but I don't think it's unavoidable. I don't think it's avoidable in real applications. Yeah, but you should really try to solve the problems properly. Yeah.
Any good examples where you would say that is an acceptable point? If you don't have
not
one.
from the top of my head.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then there's a high demand for elephants from the audience. I guess people should just hit you up for them if there's some to give
approach
away.
me later if you want.
Especially a person called Ray who asked 2 times for an elephant. So
okay, yeah.
Right.
Approach me later. I will be around till the end of the conference, so yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you again, and we will have a lunch break and see you all at 1 here again.
Thank you.